Last week as a church, we read through the Gospel of Luke, and we looked at the new thing God was doing through Jesus. This week we'll be reading Acts and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And I had two thoughts that I wanted to share about the reading this week. The first is that the new thing described in the Gospel of Luke is an unstoppable force. And we see this start to develop in Acts chapter 5, which we'll find on page 62 of our reading. After Jesus rose from the grave, he spent the next 40 days teaching and in ministry. His last instruction to the disciples was that they should go out into the world and they should tell absolutely everyone about him. And this is exactly what they did. They didn't do it by their own ability, but they did it by the power of the Holy Spirit. Let's listen to what Luke writes. The apostles performed many signs and wonders among the people, and all the believers used to meet together in Solomon's colonnade. No one else dared join them, even though they were highly regarded by the people. Nevertheless, more and more men and women believed in the Lord and were added to their number. As a result, people brought the sick into the streets and laid them on beds and mats, so that at least Peter's shadow might fall on some of them as he passed by. Crowds also gathered from towns around Jerusalem, bringing their sick and those tormented by impure spirits, and all of them were healed. Then the high priest and all his associates, who were members of the party of the Sadducees, were filled with jealousy. They arrested the apostles and put them in the public jail. But during the night, an angel of the Lord opened the doors of the jail and brought them out. "Go stand in the temple courts," he said, "and tell the people about this new life." At daybreak, they entered the temple courts, as they had been told, and began to teach the people. There was no arguing. There was no fear. They just followed what it was Jesus told them. They didn't seem to have the excuses that hold us back. They weren't worried about their schedule. They weren't worried about their safety. They weren't worried about being outside of their comfort zone. And all throughout this, miraculous things continued to happen. And we continue to see throughout the book of Acts how God is at work, how the power of God's work is absolutely unstoppable. And we see how more and more the establishment gets worried. There's a man named Gamaliel, who was a teacher of the law, and he says this to the leaders who were worried about the new Christians. He says, "Leave these men alone. Let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God." I really do hope that these words of Gamaliel are true. But a conversation or a purpose or an activity of human origin will ultimately fail, will ultimately stop. Because if you've been on the internet in the past couple of days, if you've been on social media, Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, if you've watched a morning news show, you've undoubtedly seen a picture of this dress. Is the dress white and gold, or is it blue and black? Now, there have been heated discussions, heated disagreements. There's been argument and explanation as to why it is we see the dress one way or another. How we interpret the dress is really a factor of how our eyes work. And the way the photo is taken makes it a bit of an optical illusion that is possible for us to see either white and gold or blue and black. But really, when you think about it, does it really matter what color the dress is? Now, sometimes these conversations are fun to engage in, but other times they can be distracting from what it is that we should be doing. And we find that maybe the best way to avoid an unstoppable conversation, an argument, a disagreement, a challenging situation is to just not be a part of it in the first place. We see this happen in Acts chapter 9, which will be part of our Thursday reading on page 87. And this passage takes place in Ephesus, and the unstoppable work of God has come into conflict with idolatry. It started to cause problems, and the followers of Jesus, they know that they were right. But engaging in the argument could have opened them up to unbelievable difficulty. Let's read what Luke writes. "About that time there arose a great disturbance about the way. A silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in a lot of business for the craftsmen there. He called them together along with the workers in related trades and said, 'You know, my friends, that we receive a good income from this business. And you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus, and in practically the whole province of Asia. He says that gods made by human hands are no gods at all. There is danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited, and the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty. When they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" Soon the whole city was in an uproar. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and all of them rushed into the theater together. Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. Even some of the officials of the province, friends of Paul, sent him a message, begging him not to venture into the theater. The assembly was in confusion. Some were shouting one thing, some another. Most of the people did not even know why they were there. The Jews in the crowd pushed Alexander to the front, and they shouted instructions to him. He motioned for silence in order to make a defense before the people. But when they realized he was a Jew, they all shouted in unison for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." The city clerk quieted the crowd and said, "Fellow Ephesians, doesn't all the world know that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis, and her image which fell from heaven? Therefore, since these facts are undeniable, you ought to calm down and not do anything rash. You have brought these men here, though they have neither robbed temples nor blasphemed our goddess. If then Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a grievance against anybody, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. They can press charges. If there is anything further that you want to bring up, it must be settled in a legal assembly. As it is, we are in danger of being charged with rioting because of what has happened today. In that case, we would not be able to account for this commotion, since there is no reason for it." After he said this, he dismissed the assembly. The followers of Jesus, they knew that they were right, but they also knew that engaging in this argument with people that didn't want to be convinced or weren't open to hearing their perspective didn't accomplish anything good. They were smart to tell Paul not to go and to be involved in the conversation. Because there are times in our lives where we experience the fact that there are troublemakers all around us. There are people who like to stir the pot. There are those who want there to be drama. And no amount of good intention, no amount of truthful information is going to make a bit of difference. It's sort of like if you're not careful with the conversation about the dress. If your spouse thinks that the dress is white and gold, and you know to be true that the dress is blue and black, no amount of your explaining or taunting or trying to convince them that the dress is really blue and black when they see it as white and gold will change their mind. You're just wasting your time. And if you're not careful, you can find yourself in a throwdown over an absolutely ridiculous topic. You see, the people in Ephesus were of two camps. There were those who followed Jesus, and there were those who were not going to be convinced. And it didn't stop the work of God. Because God's work and God's movement in the world is an unstoppable force. Following God's unstoppable work in the world is a choice. And we make these type of choices all the time. We make choices to stay committed to our schoolwork, to stay committed to our jobs, to stay committed to our friendships. We make a choice to be unrelenting in our commitment, or we make a choice to give up. And following the work of God is amazing because we can keep following even when we find it to be hard, even when we find ourselves tired, even when we forget the goal, even when we get wrapped up in drama. Because we know that if our purpose is from God, then no one will be able to stop us. Amen.